The Tobacco Box. My first feeling of almost stupefied horror at seeing a man whom I had met only the day before in the full tide of life and vigour, lying there in that lonely place, literally weltering in his own blood and obviously the victim of a foul murder, speedily changed to one of angry curiosity. Who had wrought this crime? Crime it undoubtedly was. The man's attitude, the trickle of blood from his slightly parted lips across the stubble of his chin, the crimson stain on the sand at his side, the whole attitude of his helpless figure showed me that he had been attacked from the rear and probably stricken down by a deadly knife thrust through the shoulders. This was murder, black murder. And my thoughts flew to what Clegg, the landlord, had said, warningly, the previous afternoon about the foolishness of showing so much gold. Had Salter Quick disregarded that warning, flashed his money about in some other public house, been followed to this out-of-the-way spot, and run through the heart for the sake of his fistful of sovereigns? It looked like it. But then that thought fled, and another took its place. The recollection of the blood-stained linen, rag, bandage, or handkerchief which that queer man, Mr. Cazalet, had pushed into hiding in the yew hedge. Had Cazalet himself, anything to do with this crime? The instinctive desire to get an answer to this last question made me suddenly stoop down and lay my fingers upon the dead man's open palm. I was conscious, as I did so, of the extraordinary appealing helplessness of his hands. Instead of being clenched in a death agony, as I should have expected, they were stretched wide. They looked nerveless, limp, effortless. But when my fingers came to the nearest one, the right hand, I found that it was stiff, rigid, stone cold. I knew then that Salter Quick had been dead for several hours, had probably been lying there murdered, all through the darkness of the night. There were no signs of any struggle. At this point the sands were unusually firm, and for the most part all round and about the body they remained unbroken. Yet there were footprints, very faint indeed, yet traceable, and I saw at once that they did not extend beyond this spot. There were two distinct marks, one there of boots with nails in the heels. These were certainly made by the dead man. The other indicated a smaller, very light-soled boot, perhaps a slipper. A yard or so behind the body these marks were mingled. That had evidently been done when the murderer stole close up to his victim, preparatory to dealing the fatal thrust. Carefully, slowly, I traced these footsteps. They were plainly traceable, faint though they were, to the edge of the low cliff. There a gentle slope of some 12 or 15 feet in height. I traced them up its incline, but from the very edge of the cliff the land was covered by a thick wire-like turf. You could have run a heavy gun over it without leaving any impression. Yet it was clear that two men had come across it to that point, had then descended the cliff to the sand, walked a few yards along the beach, and then one had murdered the other. Standing there, staring around me, I was suddenly startled by the explosion of a gun close at hand. And then, from a coppice some 30 yards away, a man emerged whom I took from his general appearance to be a gamekeeper. Unconscious of my presence, he walked forward in my direction, picked up a bird which his shot had brought down, and was thrusting it into a bag that hung at his hip when I called to him. He looked round sharply, caught sight of me, and came slowly in my direction, wondering I could see who I was. I made towards him. He was a middle-aged, big-framed man, dark of skin and hair, sharp-eyed. "Are you Mr. Raven's gamekeeper?" I asked, as I got within speaking distance. "Just so. I am staying with Mr. Raven, and I've just made a terrible discovery. There is a man lying behind the cliff there, dead." "Dead, sir?" he exclaimed. "What, washed up by the tide, likely?" "No," I said. "He's been murdered, stabbed to death." He let out a short, sibilant breath, looking at me with rapidly dilating eyes. They ran me all over, as if he wondered whether I were romancing. "Come this way," I continued, leading him to the edge of the cliff, "and mind how you walk on the sand. There are footmarks there, and I don't want them interfered with till the police have examined them. There," I continued, as we reached the edge of the turf and came in view of the beach. "You see?" He gave another exclamation of surprise, then carefully followed me to the dead man's side, where he stood wonderingly at the stains on the sand. "He must have been dead for some hours," I whispered. "He's stone cold and rigid. Now, this is murder. You live about here, no doubt? Did you see or hear anything of this man in the neighbourhood last night, or in the afternoon of evening?" "I, sir?" he exclaimed. "No, sir, nothing." "I met him yesterday afternoon on the headlands between this and Alnwick," I remarked. "I was with him for a while at the Mariner's Joy. He pulled out a big handful of gold there to pay for his lunch. The landlord warned him against showing so much money. Now, before we do more, I'd like to know if he's been murdered for the sake of robbery. You're doubtless quicker of hand than I am. Just slip your hand into that right-hand pocket of his trousers and see if you feel money there." He took my meaning on the instant, and bending down did what I suggested. A smothered exclamation came from him. "Money?" he said. "His pocket's full of money." "Bring it out," I commanded. He withdrew his hand, opened it. The palm was full of gold. The light of the morning sun flashed on those coins as if in mockery. We both looked at them, and then at each other, with a sudden mutual intelligence. "Then it wasn't robbery!" I exclaimed. "So—" He thrust back the gold, and pulling a thick chain of steel which lay across Quick's waistcoat, drew out a fine watch. "Gold again, sir," he said, "and a good 'un that's never been bought for less than £30. No, it's not robbery." "No," I agreed, "and that makes it all the more mysterious. What's your name?" "Tarver, sir, at your service," he answered, as he rose from the dead man's side. "Been on this estate a many years, sir." "Well, Tarver," I said, "the only thing to be done is that I must go back to the house and tell Mr. Raven what's happened and send for the police. Do you stay here, and if anybody comes along, be very careful to keep them off those footmarks." "Not likely that there'll be anybody, sir," he remarked. "As lonely a bit of coast this as there is hereabouts. What beats me," he added, "is what was he, and the man as did it, doing here? There's nought to come here for. And it must ha' happened in the night, judging by the looks of him." "The whole thing's a profound mystery," I answered. "We shall hear a lot more of it." I left him standing by the dead man and went hurriedly away towards Ravensdene Court. Glancing at my watch as I passed through the belt of pine, I saw that it was already getting on to 9 o'clock and breakfast time. But this news of mine would have to be told. There was no time for waiting or for ceremony. I must get Mr. Raven aside at once, and we must send for the nearest police officer, and— Just then, 50 yards in front of me, I saw Mr. Cazalette vanishing round the corner of the long yew hedge at the end nearest to the house. So he had evidently been back to the place whereat he had hidden the stained linen, whatever it was. Coming up to that place a moment later, and making sure that I was not observed, I looked in amongst the twigs and foliage. The thing was gone. This deepened the growing mystery more than ever. I began against my will to piece things together. Mr. Cazalet, returning from the beach, hides a blood-stained rag. I, going to the beach, find a murdered man. Coming back, I ascertained that Mr. Cazalet has already removed what he had previously hidden. What connection was there, if any at all, between Mr. Cazalet's actions and my discovery? To say the least of it, the whole thing was queer, strange, and even suspicious. Then I caught sight of Mr. Cazalet again. He was on the terrace in front of the house with Mr. Raven. They were strolling up and down before the open window of the morning room, chatting, and I was thankful that Miss Raven was not with them, and that I saw no sign of her near presence. I determined to tell my gruesome news straight out. Mr. Raven, I felt sure, was not the man to be startled by tidings of sudden death, and I wanted, of set purpose, to see how his companion would take the announcement. So, as I walked up the steps of the terrace, I loudly called my host's name. He turned, saw from my expression that something of moment had happened, and hurried toward me, Cazalet trotting in his rear. I gave a warning look in the direction of the house and its open windows. "I don't want to alarm Miss Raven," I said in a low voice, which I purposely kept as matter-of-fact as possible. "Something has happened. You know the man I was telling you of last night, Salter Quick? I found his dead body half an hour ago on your beach. He has been murdered, stabbed to the heart. Your gamekeeper, Tarver, is with him. Had you not better send for the police?" I carefully watched both men as I broke the news. Its effect upon them was different in both cases. Mr. Raven started a little, exclaimed a little. He was more wonder-struck than horrified. But Mr. Cazalet's mask-like countenance remained immobile. Only a glance of sudden, almost pleased interest showed itself in his black, shrewd eyes.